Good afternoon and welcome to another segment of Bad Bosses, the podcast. As we start out today, Bad Bosses is proud to say that we support all of our troops, both currently active and all of our veterans, as well as our law enforcement community and our first responders. And on that note, today we're very lucky to have with us former Chief Deputy from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department, as we are going to start our Law Enforcement Leadership Series. And he's going to tell us a little bit about what it means to be a leader in law enforcement. So my guest today is Tony Callisto, again, former Chief Deputy of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department. And we're going to roll right into it. And Tony, you want to tell us what brought you into law enforcement?
It's a great question, Joe. I was actually always drawn to law enforcement as a kid. And when I was 15 years old, a Solvay police officer, the village of Solvay police officer, came to Solvay High School where I was going to school. I was high school junior at the time, early in the junior year, and did a presentation. Talked about the Solvay Police Department, what the police department did. Of course, growing up in the village, I saw the village cops all the time. They were great community police officers. They interacted well, and I knew Ed Kurtz, the officer that came. He grew up down the street from me. He was only a few years older, and he talked about having an Explorers program through the Boy Scouts, but it was called the Solvay Police Explorers, and I went home, told my parents about it, and said, I'd really like to try that out. And the next thing you know, between the ages of 15 and 18, I was spending, up to 8 hours a week riding in patrol cars, learning from police officers in the village, what it was to be a village police officer, what it was to be a law enforcement officer in a small community, and what community policing was. They didn't even call it that back then, but those villages really truly did a great job of interacting with the youth in the community and with community members. And with that, I was hooked. I started taking civil service tests. I went to Onondaga Community College and for criminal justice as a result of that, and started taking civil service tests. By the time I was 19 years old, I was hired as a deputy at the sheriff's office and worked in the jail, the old public safety building jail downtown Syracuse, and that really just kicked off my career as a law enforcement officer in central New York that spanned 4 decades.
So speak to, if you can, a little bit. So you get hired by the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department. Was that, in the early 80s?
Yeah, 1981.
1981. And then, your career with the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department spanned over, a 20-year,
25-year
25-year period.
Yeah. And so I had some interesting jobs at the sheriff's office and some great bosses and some bosses that had some challenges. And, I was there for some very interesting things. So it was a great 25 years. I rose through the ranks, was a sergeant at the age of 25. And ran the courthouse security unit and the transport unit then. By the time about 3 years into that, I was moved into administration and did some administrative support work and internal affairs work. And then, then the county was about to build a new jail, and the sheriff tapped on me to participate in a transition team that was going to guide the building of the facility and kind of do some research and figure out what we needed to build and work with architects and engineers. And I ended up running that project as a lieutenant. And by the time the building was built, the Justice Center was built in 1995. I was appointed chief deputy in 96, the end of 96. And for a decade, ran the Justice Center until I had the opportunity to go work at the university's public safety department.
So let's go back a little bit. So the sheriff at that time, if I'm correct, was that John Dillon?
John Dillon.
Dillon?
Absolutely great, great boss.
So yep. John Dillon, that's great that you mentioned that, because as we talk about bosses, so he was kind of like your first real boss at the sheriff's department, would you say?
That's right. I obviously had supervisors between me and him, but we hit it off early on. John Dillon had a soft heart for folks from Solvay for some reason. He would tell me he grew up on Avery Ave, which is on the border of Solvay, and there was a constant tug and pull and fighting with Solvay kids. And,
oh wow!
But he loved the Solvay kids, and so he actually kind of had a soft heart for me, and in many ways treated me like a son for many of the years that I was there.
That's great. a lot of people don't really understand how the ranking within law enforcement works. And when we think of bosses, or we think of bad bosses and good bosses, is there a litmus test, or is there just, my understanding is it's just a civil service exam. And then you can take one for the sergeant, and then so on and so on. Can you speak to that a little bit? And then we can get into, how do people become good bosses within law enforcement, or bad bosses or poor bosses, especially. And then we can probably talk a little bit about, the differences back in that time frame to right up through the 90s and into the 2000s, and how much law enforcement and leadership has changed, and the challenges that we now face as a society.
Yeah, so civil service here in New York State is the basis for pretty much all law enforcement jobs. Entry-level jobs, there's a basic civil service exam, and then at the promotional levels, each of the promotional levels, pretty much up to the most senior ranks, there's a test for sergeant, a test for lieutenant, a test for captain. There's typically no test at the assistant chief or deputy chief and chief ranks in most organizations, most of the larger organizations. Smaller law enforcement agencies like a village or a town police department, even the chief of police is civil service. But when we talk about organizations like the sheriff's office or the Syracuse Police Department, the large organizations where populations are 140,000 or more, here in New York State, there's not a requirement for civil service exams, above the rank of captain in these areas. So the deputy chiefs in the city police, the chief deputies in the sheriff's office are all appointed by the chief law enforcement officers for each of those jurisdictions. So in the case of the sheriff's office, an elected sheriff. In the case of the Syracuse Police Department, an appointed Syracuse police chief. And the police chief and the mayor basically appoint all the deputy chiefs. The sheriff appoints all his chief deputies and his undersheriff. And so the ranks below, those are important supervisory ranks and important bosses along the way. And the good thing about civil service is that it's intended to measure for competency and to limit political influence on those ranks. And so a police sergeant in the Syracuse Police Department, a sheriff's sergeant, they're going to have to pass that civil service exam to show some level of competency in law enforcement. And then the rules are pretty simple. After that, the leadership has the ability to promote within the civil service list one out of every top three on the list. So if you're number 1, 2, or 3 on the list, you got a shot in 3 of getting it. But once somebody gets promoted, if you're still on the list, you might have moved up, or you might have been number 1. You're still within that top 3. So they got to consider you along the way, but it's not automatic. So they can do interview processes to further evaluate whether a person has the kinds of skill sets necessary. As a chief deputy, I had lots of opportunities to hire and promote folks in the organization, and so I worked within that rule of 3, but really always looked for the best possible candidates that I thought would step up and be the kind of leader that I want to be led by.
It's an interesting contrast to private sector because, private sector, you don't have something like that and you take a chance on a candidate. But yet the flip side to that is, within law enforcement, you have the ability to pick from more or less an isolated group instead of a bigger pool. May or may not be trained, so there may or may not be more training in the private sector than there is in the law enforcement sector. Can you speak to that at all a little bit? I mean, how does that it's kind of an interesting dynamic, because most places that you work at, you get recognized, and then they either promote you and you've done a good job, and those of us that have been in the workforce for years, and even those coming in, you think that a promotion to a management position is a reward. Is that always the case, and how does that work with law enforcement?
Well, through the civil service system, certainly the performance of an officer is measured as they look at the 1 in 3 rule for promotion, and they're looking for quality candidates, people who have a good work history, a good background, but also in law enforcement, there's opportunities for leadership at every rank, and so this if somebody's been a field training officer if somebody has been an academy class instructor, if somebody has taken on additional or new or different roles with different units within a law enforcement agency, those experiences become part of the background that's helpful to move someone up to the next position when they're looking for that 1 in 3 to promote.
So that's really good to know. So essentially, law enforcement has kind of an internal screening process. You have opportunities. You take those opportunities. You have a chance to prove yourself to others, and so on. And that kind of decides who's gonna be the boss. And have you seen circumstances where people didn't rise to the occasion because they were a bad boss? And how does law enforcement weed that out on their own?
Very, very difficult with civil service. So here's the challenge. Sometimes the 3 candidates of the 1 in 3 rule are just not good candidates, the organizations sometimes will sit down with somebody and say, hey, you're not ready yet. Would you consider signing off? Because there might be a candidate that has all of the potential, has lots of experience, and engaged in leadership at a line level position, been a field training officer, whatever, that really leadership in the organization thinks really should be moved up, but most folks don't sign off, and so then you've got a 6-month probationary period under civil service for promotees, and they're under scrutiny. They're going to be evaluated and supervised. Some people don't make it through probation. Most people do, even if they're not the best boss, but if they meet the minimum criteria. So sometimes civil service kind of nets us mediocrity. And in civil service also creates ownership for the incumbent. So once a person's in a civil service position past the probationary period, they own the job. They literally have an ownership right to the job, which then requires pretty significant process to remove somebody or demote somebody or terminate somebody from a civil service position. So it's really important for senior leadership to truly evaluate and try to find the best candidates within the civil service rules.
So in today's world, you hear a lot of talk about training. You hear a lot of talk about leadership skills, compassion, empathy, things that weren't spoken about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and maybe even as recent as 10 or 15 years ago. So in law enforcement, I think the public would really be interested in knowing, so you become a sergeant, you become a lieutenant, you become a captain. Do the members of law enforcement community, do they send people at those ranks to training? Do they offer them leadership skill training? How does that work in law enforcement? How is that different than the private sector? So
it's a great question, Joe. So here in New York, specifically, the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services promulgates rules around public safety officers here in New York. And so there are requirements for law enforcement officers that are promoted to the civil service positions, as well as law enforcement officers for organizations like Syracuse University. A peace officer promoted into a sergeant position at the Public Safety Department literally goes through the same training that a Syracuse Police Sergeant would go through. And there's a formal 3-week school, 40 hours per week, 3 weeks, that is a mix of classroom opportunities to learn about leadership principles, basic supervision responsibilities, in the science and art of leadership and management, and we'll talk about that in more detail maybe in another conversation at some point. But really does focus on how to supervise law enforcement folks. The fire service has the same thing. My son Anthony is a lieutenant in the city fire department. He had to go through a similar 4-week program with city fire to learn how to be a fire officer. And so, within these civil service organizations, the state does offer some common curriculum that is universal throughout the state. I actually have been a part of the faculty for a couple of decades, and
That's great.
still currently teach in the supervisor school for law enforcement and community.
Is New York unique in that, or does every state have their own kind of program?
Every
Some
state
don't?
has different requirements, and some have no requirements whatsoever. But so I can speak to what New York has because being a participant in training folks in this area, and it's not a bad program. The end of it, the culminating experience in the New York model is a week around emergency management and putting kind of walking through the different types of emergencies a law enforcement officer might be responsible to supervise, and then an entire day dedicated to scenarios to have them play out responses and how they might direct and supervise and lead in a crisis situation. So we try to make it real and practical.
So you transitioned your career at some point from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department to Syracuse University. Can you speak a little bit about the change? And it probably wasn't as structured as the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department. You did take over as the chief of a law enforcement body, but there were some pretty significant differences, I would imagine, as well. And can you speak to those?
So let me just start out by saying leadership is leadership, and I've had my own bad boss behaviors. At both organizations, both the university and at the sheriff's office. I hope that I far outweighed the good boss practices and behaviors, but we're all human beings, and I think it's important to note that. From a leader moving from a senior public organization like the sheriff's office, where I had lots of constituents, the county legislature, the county executive, obviously the sheriff and senior leaders at the sheriff's office, the union that the deputies are represented by, generally constituents in the community that had interests throughout the county, and having the multiple responsibilities in the sheriff's office, but one of those running the Justice Center. Also the folks that are incarcerated, their families, activist groups, those were all the constituents. When I transitioned to the university, I've got to take those same leadership skills now and apply them to the board of trustees and the chancellor and deans of the various schools and colleges, and the same kinds of skills that I use to supervise senior leaders and mid-level law enforcement leaders and ranking deputies applied at Syracuse University. Big difference, no civil service. So as a hiring manager, in a promotion setting, I had a lot more responsibility to be more scrutinizing because there wasn't that testing mechanism provided by an external entity like the state. And so, thankfully, having lots of experience in promotions, applied a lot of what I learned and what I was looking for from the sheriff's office to the university. But we were freed up to really pretty much promote and hire, based on basic business principles as opposed to civil service tests. And likewise, probationary periods were important, but had a lot more leverage with regards to if we had someone even 5, 6, 10, 8 years on the job, whatever, that really had some problems, we'd try to work them through a pathway of improvement, but we could fire people, and that was a lot different than what we had at the sheriff's office. So, the ability to use employment status as a tool to improve performance and behavior was really a good benefit to being able to lead in that organization.
Thinking about your career in maybe its entirety, when you think about your bosses, and you said they were both good and bad, did you feel like you took away things from, say, a bad boss, and could you speak to that, and things that you took away from, a good boss? Although the podcast is named Bad Bosses, we hope to identify, at least for the public's sake, attributes of good bosses and attributes of bad bosses, so that people kind of know what to look for in general. Because, what inspired me to start this podcast was that everybody at some point in their careers had a bad boss. Maybe in the beginning, maybe in the middle, maybe at the end, maybe longer than that. But some of us, and most of us, take away attributes from these bosses and kind of model ourselves, especially if we haven't had a mentor or any formal training. Some organizations do, some organizations don't. Can you speak to a little bit about that? What bosses influenced you one way or the other, both bad and good?
And so I'll say this, and pretty much every boss I had, I could learn both something good from, and I can look and say that's something I don't want to do. And you can learn really a lot from the bad behaviors of a boss who's more of a bad boss, and what not to do. And so there was a point in time as a first line supervisor where the next rank up was a very bright young guy, had a lot of great ideas, was pretty good at motivating people, but there came a point in our relationship with each other where I became a threat. And instead of trying to encourage my performance and encourage my independent decision making and provide guidance and provide direction and articulate goals that I could work with my team to move forward, there became a point when he really tried to shut me down. And ironically, leaders above him saw this happening and moved me to a different role. And ultimately, I ended up being his boss over the course of the next few years. And so that can happen. But what the good boss, Tony Callisto, did in that case is I never held a grudge. I understood. There was an ego that I was dealing with that had to be managed once I became the boss. But everything that I would want him to be able to do for me, I did for him when I was his boss. I articulated clarity and goals. I set a pathway for things that I wanted to see accomplished. I gave him the freedom to do it within his own team and in the way that he wanted to do it. But I did remind him that, hey, back when you were my boss, here's some things you did that really felt bad, and you ought to probably not do these things as you're moving forward in the organization. So, there's plenty to learn from folks.
Is that
ego's a big challenge?
Is that something that you learned from a good boss? And applied because you saw a good boss do exactly what you said, not hold a grudge, which is difficult because let's face it, we're all human beings, and in the work environment is like your family. You spend more of your time there than probably with your family, especially in law enforcement. So did you learn that skills from a good boss and applied that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I had some great mentors like Chuck Pirro was a chief deputy when I was promoted to sergeant and lieutenant, and he and John Dillon saw potential in me and gave me opportunities to prove myself. And so as a leader, I saw my responsibility as mentoring and giving opportunity to others. You have to pass that on forward. In Chuck Pirro, I saw one of the most passionate, visionary leaders. And so I knew I had to have passion and vision to be able to articulate goals and set a vision and be able to articulate that vision to folks that work for me. Conversely, I've had folks who were yellers and were demanding in ways that were unreasonable and would not offer guidance but offer criticism. And so that's something I learned. I don't want to be that kind of boss. Now, have I been a bad boss? Have I criticized unjustly? Yes. Have I forgotten the principles occasionally? Yes. And one of the most important things for me was the people that worked around me and for me, I would ask them for input, and I would ask them to be honest with me. Was that out of line? Was that something I shouldn't have done? And you and I worked together for years, and there were times when I asked you,
absolutely,
was I okay at this one, Joe?
Yeah.
Or did I go off half cocked? So we got to be to a degree, we got to be humble. We got to be able to provide direction, but we also got to be able to accept feedback in a way that we might be able to change course a bit and give people the freedom they need to get the job done.
So, as we'll probably come to the end here a little bit.
Yeah.
Definitely going to have you back and speak about law enforcement, but a couple of things that, as you think about law enforcement and the changes in our society, and you think about how leadership plays a role in that. I don't remember which department it was, but there was something I was quite impressed with during the protest back before COVID, that one of the chiefs, I think it was down south, I should have had that information, actually had his officers and himself put down their firearms and marched with the protesters because he agreed with them. Now, that's probably an extreme example or extreme case, but, as law enforcement has changed over the years, what do you see the challenge in leadership being, and screening officers for promotions and creating good bosses? Because the community is now really much more involved, at least from my opinion, in law enforcement, from a law enforcement perspective, than it might have been, back 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, so the expectations of the community are significantly higher in the past decade. Well, let's face it, there were incidences starting in about 2014 that raised concerns around police use of force, police interaction in the community, communities, minority communities being over-policed, and whether it's whether the circumstances were real or not. The perception became, for the past decade, that the police were not a focal point of safety, that the community was safer when the police weren't around in some cases. And so leadership in law enforcement had to do a lot of soul searching, number one, and a lot of hard work to start to build really good relationships with community members. And one of the best examples in law enforcement in this community of a longtime chief who was able to build relationships in the community and still have great relationships and exhibit outstanding leadership within his ranks was Chief Frank Fowler from the Syracuse Police Department. Longtime colleague of mine. I worked with Frank a lot over the years in different capacities, both at the sheriff's office and the university. And what I saw in Frank was this ability to be able to transcend different parts of the community and connect with people. He was the same Frank Fowler when he went into one of the minority community churches as he was when he went into the city common council. He was the same Frank Fowler who also was able to interact with union leadership and stand up for his people publicly when they were right. When a crisis situation happened, he was as transparent as he could be, and when there was something that was wrong, he'd work to fix it, and he'd articulate what was wrong and it was wrong and what he was going to do about it. But equally important, when community members might raise a red flag about something that they thought the police department or police officers under his command were doing, he'd fully investigate and then fully educate the community on what the reality was and support the officers when they were right and deal with the challenges when they were wrong. Frank showed the best kind of leadership in law enforcement in an urban setting that I've seen around the country. During his tenure, there were several incidences where people died as a result of police use of force. And the way he managed those, right from the initial incidences, right through the investigations and the reviews by grand jury, and ultimately, finding that the officers involved in these incidences had legitimate justification and these were legitimate threats. He was able to work with the families, with the churches, with the community, and with the cops to walk us through that when other places had pandemonium and protests that rose to riots in some cases during that 10-year period. Frank was all over it, a leading communicator in the community and a leading law enforcement officer for his ranks.
So you actually touched on something that we'd probably get to and we'll talk about in probably in other episodes of Bad Bosses. But you talk about a skill that a lot of people don't talk about, and it's something that I learned early in my career as well, but something you also reinforced when I had the opportunity to work for you, which is building relationships. And how important of a skill is that in a manager and a boss and a leader? Because really, when we talk about leadership, really it becomes, once you become a higher up in an organization, it kind of shifts and changes. So
let's talk specifically about law enforcement, because that's really been our topic today. So the ability to create relationships and foster relationships and have those relationships be meaningful is critical. And you and I at some point will talk about more general topics around leadership. But when we think about a community leader like a law enforcement administrator, it is critical that they're able to create relationships in the community, that the principles of Sir Robert Peel from Old England and the creation of the Metropolitan London Police Department are key principles today. The people are the police.
First police department, right?
That's right. The people are the police, and the police are the people.
Yeah.
And so, recognizing that as a law enforcement leader is critical. And so, engaging the community, doing community citizens police academies to educate community members, invite them in so they see, what law enforcement is all about. Doing programs like the Solvay Police Department's Explorers program, for youngsters that might have an interest to have them see the value of community policing. All that's really important. The relationships are key. And relationships don't stop at the community. They really have to also be with political leaders within that jurisdiction, as well as with the rank and file of the department. You got to be all things to all people to be a law enforcement leader today.
Yeah.
And that's the reality, of the 21st century and really this last decade.
And really be a good boss.
Yeah,
that's so important today
you gotta
in
be
law enforcement.
You got to be a good boss. But when you say the word good bosses, it's really more about the art of leadership than it is, managing people and managing an organization. Management is important. Science management is important. But when we talk about law enforcement, leadership in law enforcement, effective communication, effective interactive relationships, effective supervision, effective walk the talk kind of boss is necessary, so that officers will kind of think about, well, what would the chief do?
Absolutely.
When they're confronted with 3 o'clock in the morning situation, what would the chief want me to do? What would, if I'm engaged in this situation, how should I react? And it's a tough line. It's a tough line because you're engaged in a violent world, and you can use violence to counteract violence legally in the law enforcement business. And we really have to spend a lot of time also educating our officers on the role and the restraint of that power, and how they really need to really think through how they react and act even when confronted with violence. And that is a life and death moment. It's got to be split-second decisions, and we have to encourage that. And like I said, Frank Fowler is a great example. Mm-hmm. He recognized, the challenges of use of force moments, and was able to articulate to his officers what his expectations were, and articulate to the community how his cops were going to react.
So as we wrap this segment up, and we're definitely going to have you back because I'm committed to doing a series of law enforcement leadership and management skills. What advice, let's close with that. What advice would you give to those that are interested in going into law enforcement today, and how they should look at it? And it's not just a civil service exam. Obviously, it's much more than that, especially in the world that exists in the present day.
Yeah, so, first responder roles in general are not jobs. They're not careers. To do this right, it's a vocation. It is a way of life.
Yeah.
Whether, my 2 sons are firefighters, that's their professional job here in the city of Syracuse, but ultimately it's a vocation for them. They're outstanding at their work. They work as a team with their, fellow firefighters, and everybody's got everybody's back. It's not just a job. Law enforcement, EMS, all of, those kind of first responder roles are really, it's really important to be a vocation. So number one, if you don't have a passion for it, it's not something you should do. It's not just a job. That's
the first time I've heard, and I think we should end with that. It's a vocation.
Yeah.
So people, upping it to that level, take it serious. It's a vocation. It's a lifestyle.
That's right. And you've got to think in terms of community first. You know what? You're there to serve and protect the community. Those are, a lot of times a police car says serve and protect. Well, what does that really mean? That means we need to be able to be a resource for community members. We need to be a voice of reason on somebody's worst day. And we need to have created relationships outside of our department to be able to lead people to resources that might be able to help them from a non-law enforcement perspective. That's important too. So yeah, I mean, the idea that that I need to to walk into this as a job is set aside. I really need to be a resource for people. I need to be there on their worst day and be a positive force for good. And sometimes that means I might have to arrest somebody. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that means my intervention in this moment is getting them away from the scene, and that's the reality of it. Sometimes it's being there to save a life, to run in when everybody else is running out. That's not something that's just a job. That's a mission first, community first.
I love the way you articulated that. Last thing, you do consulting on the side. You want to talk a little bit about that? Do you consult with law enforcement agencies across the country?
Yeah, so I do work as an expert witness in law enforcement and corrections related cases around the country, where attorneys will hire me to look at a case and offer opinions with regards to the administration of the operation, or a particular kind of incident where there may have been a death, and opine with regards to whether whether or not it was consistent with a reasonable standard of care. I provide security consulting around the country, where I do risk analysis, risk assessment, and offer people ideas to improve the security of their organization or their structure or their building. And I do training around the country for law enforcement and corrections, in providing leadership training and training on how to effectively run and manage an organization. And so have had a lot of great opportunities to meet a lot of great people. But I've been doing consulting part-time since '97 and more full-time since I retired. Tony at TonyCallisto.com. Callisto Consulting. TonyCallisto.com.
That's awesome. Promise me you'll come back and we'll continue the conversation on leadership and law enforcement.